Since Carl Benz invented the motor car in the 1800s, there have been numerous brands that you, I, our dads, whoever, would have owned. Nissan, Honda, Skoda, Vauxhall, Rover, Peugeot, Renault, the list goes on. Then you've got the more luxurious stuff. Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Land Rover, Jaguar, Mercedes, Audis, and then you move into the proper fast sports car territory. McLaren, Porsche, Pagani, Koenigsegg, Lamborghini, and all the other stuff that an 8-year-old would see on Top Gear and go, wow! Well, I mean, not anymore, obviously, because it's just been canned, hasn't it? But there is one brand above all else. A brand that could actually put out a terrible, terrible, terrible car, and people will still love it because, well, the badge that's on it, and that brand is Ferrari. And these car companies will have their own sort of trademark colours, if you will. Most of them based off the old national racing colours of days gone by, before sponsorship became the big thing in racing and cars became the colours of, well, whoever paid the most money, as opposed to the colour of where that car came from. Aston Martin, Lotus, Bentley and Jaguar all have varying shades of green. Aston's is more of a teal turquoise colour, Bentley's is a dark green, while Lotus has what many would consider to be the British racing green shade. Meanwhile, Porsches and Mercedes tend to be silver. Renault's sporty cars are yellow, but that's more Renault's corporate colour, while Alpines are blue. But over in Italy, there is only one generally accepted colour that cars from there can be, and that is red, especially when it comes to Ferrari. But what if I was to tell you that in the 1960s there was a brief period where Ferraris in Formula 1 were not red, but blue? Rossa Corsa is Ferrari. There is no other way of putting it. Sometimes you'll see a white one or a yellow one, but if you're going to buy a Ferrari, it has to be red, unless you want to be shunned by the car-loving community. There was a guy who wrapped his Ferrari in green or something, might have been some rapper, and that got Ferrari mighty upset. But then again, it is Ferrari. Chris Harris did a whole thing on how dealing with them can be the most hair-pulling exercise on the planet, and that got him banned from testing Ferraris for a time, but I digress. And going into the 1960s, Enzo's racing empire was expanding outwards into other categories beyond Formula 1. Enzo's cars had done things like the Targa Florio and the Mille Miglia, winning its first Targa in 1948 with the 166 SC, and that car won at Le Mans the following year. We'll get to that in a minute, but things were now branching out further, with Ferrari being more interested in entering factory-backed cars as opposed to customer-entered cars. In 1962, Ferrari had built the 250 GTO. Rules at the time said that a number of road-going versions had to be built, but when the FIA came round to count them, or the ACO depending on which version of the story you read, Ferrari hadn't built enough. So they had the cars in the room, the FIA counted them, Enzo took them for a coffee, and then they went to another room where the rest of the cars were supposed to be. Plot twist, they were the same cars, just moved rooms. The FIA counted them twice. Now, how much of that story is true will remain a mystery, so take that with a pinch of salt. But 2 years later in 1964, Ferrari wanted to homologate a new car for Le Mans called the 250 LM, and after the previous stunt, the FIA couldn't see Ferrari building the required amount of cars, and they said, well, look Enzo, you're welcome to enter this as a prototype if you want, because we've got this new category and... This got Enzo very, very cross, and he started making threats. He then went to see his friends at the ACI, which is a little bit like MSUK in Britain or CAMS in Australia, basically the governing body for motorsport in Italy. And he had a word with them, thinking that he might be able to strong-arm them into strong-arming the FIA, but the ACI said, look Enzo, we can't really do anything here. So Enzo was even more enraged than he already was. He handed back his competition license and declared that Ferrari will never race in Rosso Corsa ever again. This was a massive deal, because this was 1964 and national colours hadn't been replaced by sponsor liveries yet. That would happen about 5 years later after Lotus went full gold leaf. Red was Italy in racing. To have a Ferrari not in red, that was a big, big thing that Enzo did. But there was one small problem. Enzo had done this just after the Italian Grand Prix of 1964. There were still 2 rounds left, one in the United States and one in Mexico, and he'd effectively withdrawn his entry when one of his drivers, John Surtees, had a very realistic shot at taking the title. The 1964 season was going to Britain one way or the other, because the 3 main contenders that year were Surtees in the Ferrari, Jim Clark in the Lotus, and Graham Hill in the BRM. Hill and Clark were already world champions. Hill in 62 and Clark in 63. So it was going to be a British champion 3 times in a row. The last time the same nationality had done this would have been when Fangio won his 3rd in a row in 1956. With Enzo handing back his licence, there was no way Surtees could finish the season. But there was another way in, and this was done because of somebody Enzo knew on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1949, Luigi Ketti had met with Enzo at Maranello and asked for a Ferrari so he could enter it at Le Mans, the same model of Ferrari that had won the Targa the previous year. Enzo had told Luigi, "No, we're not ready for that yet," so Ketti arranged for a wealthy Englishman and a gentleman driver to purchase the car on his behalf and entered into the 24-hour race anyway. And he won. Ketti lived in the United States, which is in America. After the outbreak of World War II in Europe, he'd moved to the US to race at Indianapolis and other races because America hadn't entered the war yet, and he'd obtained American citizenship by the end of the decade. I think he was living in Connecticut at the time. He also raced at every 24 hours of Le Mans between 1932 and 1953. Ketti had met with Ferrari on one Christmas Eve after the war. Ketti had convinced Enzo that he needed to keep on making sports cars. Ferrari's factory had been converted during the war to start producing stuff for the war effort, and Ketti said that he could sell Ferrari's cars in the US, and then placed an order then and there for 25 vehicles. Ketti had already been selling Alphas in America, and Enzo didn't think he'd be able to pull off selling 25 Ferraris over there, but either way, Ketti left that meeting as Ferrari's North American agent, and within a few years, his territory was basically everything east of the Mississippi River. In 1958, Ketti set up the North American Racing Team, or NART, with backing from George Arendts Jr. and Jan de Vroom, which is a brilliant name for somebody involved in motorsport. With the relationship he had with Ferrari back at Maranello, the team had a steady supply of cars and got all the factory support it needed. They also only raced at the world's biggest races, Sebring, Daytona, Le Mans, races like that, or just races in North America in general. Their first win in the World Sports Car Championship would be at Bridgehampton in 1962 and would also win the 1,000 kilometres of Paris that year. They'd also win Daytona twice, 1963 and 1964. So with Enzo having this hissy fit over this mid-engine GT car not being homologated, and I think that's why it was refused homologation. It was mid-engined, not front-engined, and that's why they said, oh, you can enter it as a prototype. They still had these 2 rounds left of the season, so Surtees and Bandini went over to the United States and were given their Ferraris. But they weren't Ferraris, if you get me. The rest of the grid was left confused when Surtees and Bandini turned up in Ferraris painted in blue and white, the national racing colours of the US, for the race at Watkins Glen. What's even more interesting is that 6 drivers at that Watkins Glen race were in with a mathematical chance of taking the title. Those drivers were John Surtees, Jim Clark, Graham Hill, Lorenzo Bandini, Richie Ginther and Bruce McLaren. Hill actually led the standings. He had 32 points while Clark was behind on 30 and Surtees on 28, so 4 points separating the top 3. The others, Ginther, Bandini and McLaren, had mathematical chances, but winning the title would depend on the 3 Brits retiring from the next 2 races. NART was running Ferrari's cars from the early part of the season. The 158 F1 driven by Surtees that had a V8 engine, and the brand new 1512 F1 that had a V12 for Bandini, and this was going to be the first race that car was going to be made available. But Enzo didn't have his name on them. These were Maranello's Ferraris, but the whole operation was under NART's control. They were Ferraris entered by somebody else. Enzo wasn't doing anything, he just gave them the cars and had them run it as a satellite operation. Meanwhile, Colin Chapman had brought 2 cars for Clark. One was the car that Jimmy had been using the rest of the season, the 25, the other was the new 33. Clark had a little go in the 33 in practice but decided to stick with the more reliable 25 that he was used to, and Clark set the pole time for the race. Clark would lead the opening 50% of the race, around 54 laps of the scheduled 110, but then his Lotused on him. The fuel injector went a bit iffy, so Clark pulled into the pits and Chapman brought in his teammate so that Clark could go back out in his teammate's car, but then that car conked out as well. So what happened was Hill and Surtees went by. Hill would win the race ahead of Surtees by about 30 seconds or so, and those were the only 2 cars on the lead lap come the end. Clark was 7th. Going into the final round in Mexico, Hill had 39 points, Surtees 34, Clark 39. Clark's chances had pretty much gone, but he could still win the title pending a miracle. In these days, the top 6 were awarded points. 9 for the winner, then 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. It turned into 10, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 at the start of the 90s. If Clark won the race, Hill non-scored and Surtees was third, they would have all been tied on the same amount of points. But because Jimmy had already won 3 races that year, going to be 4 if he won in Mexico, and Surtees and Hill had just 2 each, Jimmy would have been champion because he'd won more races. Surtees would have been second because he and Graham were tied on second places with 3 each, but Surtees would have had 2 third places to Hill's none. What a thrilling end to the season that would have been on TV. But really, the title fight was between Hill and Surtees. Clark was as good as out, but Queen and Country would have had a champion for the 3rd year in a row, regardless. But early in the race, Bandini collided with Graham and that knocked the man with the Dick Dastardly moustache out of the points. Surtees, meanwhile, was having engine problems. Surtees managed to shift these engine issues and carry on. Graham, meanwhile, pulled into the pits and emerged 2 laps down, so it looked like Jimmy might win the title after all. He was winning the Grand Prix, Surtees was in 4th, so lower than he needed to be, but if Surtees was 3rd, Clark would still win, and Graham was out of the points. It was all lining up perfectly. Clark was on for an unlikely championship, like Raikkonen was in 2007 or Vettel in 2010, taking it right at the end. But guess what happened next? Lotus happened. Well, climax happened because the problem was engine related. Meanwhile, Bandini in the faster Ferrari was allowed to pass Surtees, so he could try and chase down Clark and help out his teammate. As it stood, the order was Clark, Gurney, Bandini, Surtees. 7 laps from the end, Clark's car started leaking oil, and then on the final lap of the final Grand Prix of the season, the Lotus conked out completely. Gurney passed Clark to take the victory, while Bandini also passed Clark. Then what happened is Bandini immediately moved over so that Surtees could catch up, pass him, go into second, and take the title. So Gurney won, Surtees was second, and Bandini was third. Surtees, as a result of this, became the only man to win the Formula 1 World Championship and also the Motorcycle World Championship, or MotoGP as we know it today. In 6th place was Pedro Rodriguez, who took a single point at the track where his brother lost his life, and the reason the circuit today is known as the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, the Rodriguez Brothers Autodrome in English. It does make you wonder though, had Clark's car held on 7 laps longer, so by my calculations another 12 minutes maybe, he'd have been a 3-time champion. Such was the way these Lotuses were, but it was engine related rather than fragility related for a change. The final scores in the driver's standings had Surtees on 40 points and Hill on 39, but the rules at the time meant that only the best 6 results counted for the championship, so it meant that Hill, like Prost in 1988, scored the most points over the season, but didn't have all of them counting for the title. Clark was 3rd on 32, with Bandini in 4th. Ferrari would still take the manufacturer's title, and just like with the Drivers' Championship, only the best 6 races counted. So while BRM scored more points, not all of them counted, and Ferrari won the championship instead. The following season, Ferrari would be back in full Rosso Corsa. The dispute between Ferrari, the FIA and the ACI had all been settled, and a red Ferrari was also present at Le Mans for the 1965 edition of the race. That car, the 250 LM, was entered by Nart, and it won the race with Maston Gregory and Jochen Rindt behind the wheel, with 2 more Ferraris filling out the podium. It would also be Ferrari's last win at Le Mans until this year, when the 499P won the 100th edition. Today, it seems unthinkable that a Ferrari would be in Formula 1 not dressed in red. Okay, it's had splashes of white here and there because of the Marlboro sponsorship, it's had little bits of black and yellow here and there for various reasons, including the 911 tribute nose cones that they ran for the 2001 Italian Grand Prix. But blue Ferraris, you have to actually explain the whole blue Ferrari thing because a lot of people won't believe that a blue Ferrari actually ran in Formula 1. Because Ferraris, they're always red, aren't they? So then, a look at the time there were Ferraris in F1 in a colour other than red. If you learned something here today, then do like the video so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed with that bell on so you never miss out on any future videos. Massive thanks as ever to the kind folk at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help keep the picture purchasing piggy bank topped up, that is a real tongue twister, then a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and affiliate links. Or there's channel memberships under this video if you want to do that and spam some Roberto Moreno emojis in chat and comments whenever I do live stream. I need to do more of that. And also there's super thanks for the one and done types of donations. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.